Thank you very much, Marco, for this very nice and friendly introducing words. And I feel really honored to share today with you some aspects of my reflections on global learning, what I see as an educational research in an emerging field. And in this keynote, I want to reflect upon the implications of today's survival risks for humanity and the planet Earth, and the challenges for education related to this. And I call these learning challenges global learning, or I see global learning as an answer to these learning challenges, and I consider this as a central area of educational research for the future. And in the following hour, I firstly will present and give reasons for this idea by exploring the concept and the understanding of world society, and to reflect deeper, what does it mean that we become a world society? Secondly, I will show how these learning challenges have so far been described in educational research and point out some important aspects. And against this background, I will then present empirical research in this field in order to enrich the debate. And finally, I would like to evaluate this research and outline for some implications for further research. So, it is very obvious that our world becomes a world society. Keywords such as climate change, population growth and global migration, consumption of natural resources, plastic waste in the oceans, and the diminishing ice of the Arctic, all this describes the more and more dramatic dimensions of global development. And an important feature of this development is the closed interconnectedness of geographical spaces. So, developments in one part of the world have consequences for other parts of the world. The burning down of tropical forests, for example, has a lasting effect on the climate and has dramatic effects on many other regions in the world. And the plastic fibers of washing from fleece, pullovers, and these little fibers then can be found in fissures on the coast in Senegal. And according to a study of the Info Institute in Munich, the economic consequences of an unregulated Brexit will be felt most strongly in the Republic of Ireland and in Malta, countries that were not involved in the decision. These are just some examples of spatial interdependencies in an increasingly interconnected world society. But to reflect these challenges and to understand the learning which is behind, it is particularly important to understand the social processes related to these developments. Many scholars at this conference have given empirical data how the world is changing. And what I would like now to add on these empirical data is the wish to reflect deeper. What does it mean to become a world society? How should this be understood? And the second question then, how to learn to deal with this. And I would like to invite you for a short journey in the philosophical debate and reflections on what a world society does mean. And you may be astonished that I'm going a little bit back, because in my understanding, this is not a new discussion. It was already discussed, or the discussion started in the 18th century on the reflection of the global interconnected connectitude of space and the question how a world society then looks like. And I would like to recall the ideas of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who pointed out this dimension of interconnected sociality in his, and I quote now the title, "The Idea for a General History with a Cosmopolitan Intention" in 1784. He reflected how people could deal with these challenges associated with cosmopolitanism. He considered this as a deep learning challenge because, in his opinion, people tend to be egoistic and socially cold towards those people they do not know, and they are not personally acquainted. But, he then argued further, at the same time, it is inevitable to deal and to deal with each another and to work together with one another. And he therefore speaks of an, and now I quote him, unsociable sociability, or in German, ungesellige Geselligkeit of humankind. In modern society, so I would now add, coexistence can no longer be organized based on the idea of a small group with emotional closeness or the model of belonging together as a family, but it requires a much more abstract understanding of a social order in order to for coexistence and the development of freedom. So Immanuel Kant in his work is pointing out the necessity to reflect on the structures of living together in order to guarantee freedom. Hundreds of years later, the philosopher Niklas Luhmann described starting in the 1970s that today's society is to be understood as a world society in terms of its character, since social communication today is no longer possible independently of world social contexts. His central thesis suggests that every society today exists as a world society because it is always part of a global context. So his main argument is that every society, even if it's not seeing itself as a global society, is a global society or world society in the sense that the communication about is all the time related to global contexts. So in his words, world society does not have the form of a state or a world organization, but it consists of the sum of social, political, and cultural diversity and its interdependence. Every human being is a part of it, and it included it in a very different dimensions and segments. So it is almost impossible for every individual to be aware in which extent and in what dimension we all are enclosed in a world society. And moreover, the participation in the world society is very unequal. However, since global social interdependency has very noticeable effects almost everywhere, this new social quality, so this is one of his main arguments, must be dealt with. So his important message is to understand the mechanism of communication and to understand world society as a specific form of communication. Jacques Derrida calls this kind of order beyond the principles of brotherhood. His thinking reminds the challenges of emotions and the danger of othering and setting hierarchical differences, and he addresses the challenges of belonging in a global world. So how can we understand belonging in a global context? And the British sociologist Roland Robertson saw in these developments a new form of spatial experience experience, which he denoted this by the term glocality. So this is not a typing problem if I write glocality. Not globality, glocality. And glocality means that the global and the local are connected on the same time. And he relates his thinking to the understanding of complexity and risk management in a global society pointed out by Ulrich Beck. So, and now this is the background of my further reflections, because in the tradition of these thinkers, the understanding of the world society gets a little bit clearer. It is not a bigger family. It is not a real state. It is not a situation of direct elections and problem solving just related to a space anchor or just related to one actor. However, the world society is shaped as an abstract order with very few guiding principles, as the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, with weak decision-making structures and institutions, with high complexity, with multilateral actors in problem solving. And therefore, the world society, I see it as an abstract social sphere, and the learning challenge is then to learn abstract social relations. So if we talk about the risks we have in our interconnected world, if we reflect how to work on these risks and how to educate people to deal with these risks, I think we have to have in mind that people have to learn about abstract social relations. And this means to learn to deal in a social context with an unknown complexity and structural uncertainty. Because dealing with a world society is all the time in a social context. We all the time deal with other human beings. So if you talk about climate change or whatever, it's all the time in a social context. And this complexity and structural uncertainty results in learning tasks in regard to identity, in overcoming paternalism, the perception of challenges of global social justice, and the ability to reflect on how social solidarity can be shaped in a global spatial context. And from my understanding, all these developments are a great challenge for human beings, because human beings can be understood as a local being due to their Stone Age past and imprints. Human beings are socially linked to families and to sensually experienced communities. So we love people we know each other, and people we do not know each other, we are a little bit more distant. And this distance may differ between people, but it's a little bit more distant. So, and in this understanding, we see that people learn everything that can be experienced by senses much more easily. So what takes place in your vicinity, in your neighborhood, can be learned much quicker than what takes place wherever in the world. But, and this is now the interesting point, at the same time, humankind is gifted, and this distinguished it from all other living beings by the use of their reason, understanding, and reflection. So people have a high capacity for abstract reflection. Human beings are able to learn. And this enables them to learn abstract contexts. And we have a long history, especially in education, of course, to learn abstract things. If you reflect on how we learn mathematics, we have the inborn capacity to count from 1 to 3. That's not a lot. And by using our reasoning capacity, and by being educated, we can deal with higher mathematics. So we have learned to shape aspects in an abstract mathematical world. So, if we have learned to do this, why can't we learn to shape abstract social relations? And indeed, I think we can learn this, we can deal with this, but it requires a clear intellectual effort. And I think that global learning should promote such an abstract social learning. I call such learning global learning by using the definition of global learning from the Maastricht Declaration of the Global Education Network Europe and the European Council. And this definition says it is an education that opens people's eyes and minds to the realities of the world and awakens them to bring about a world of greater justice, equity, and human rights for all. And with this global learning approach, I see my work in the community of scholars like Asbrand, Nygaard, Wegimond, Langvoitasik, Born, Letomäki, Tarotzi, Grobauer, and a lot of other persons. And my hypothesis is that the understanding of the character of this world society as an abstract social space on a planet is from high importance for the way people act. So if we look now if you take now a short look into the state of the art of global learning, I want to just mention the first meta-study which was carried out in 2011 on global learning and global competencies. Even if it's a very young field, we already have some meta-studies, and in order to get an overview, it's all the time very good, as you know, to count on meta-studies. So the meta-study of Wiesekamp and Redman was reflecting 43 concepts of competencies in education for sustainability and global learning. With their findings, they showed that the scholars and concepts see as the most important competencies in this field: system thinking competence, anticipatory competence, normative competence, strategic competence, interpersonal and intercultural competence. And the international Delphi study by Marco Rickman supported this findings by integrating scholars from the Global South in this debate. This research had a tremendous impact at UNESCO, as UNESCO has developed a framework on global citizenship education, which is going back to these competences and now used in curricula around the world. And it had an impact for the OECD in its now ongoing research on global competencies connected to PISA, where we will have the results in December. The framework of the OECD uses the meta-study and combines it with findings from intercultural learning, especially in the United States. And under the title, what was the title? Preparing our youth for an inclusive and sustainable world, the OECD describes now 4 dimensions of global competences and global learning to examine issues and situations of local, global, and cultural significance, to understand and appreciate different perspectives and worldviews of others, to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions across cultures, and take actions for collective well-being and sustainable development. From what I said, from my understanding of world society, it comes already obvious that this way, how global learning is framed in the moment, does not particularly reflect on the abstract character of world society. And I think that the underlying understanding of world society people have is leading their action. And I want to show you with my research now, or with some research of my working group, how I understand this and how this can fit and being reflected together with these frameworks I showed you. So I come to the third point, an empirical approach. Oopsa. And I would like to introduce to you some studies where I now go much more in deeper and reflecting what is the world view and the world understanding of people who are dealing with world society. And how can this be then reflected? I want to present you 3 studies. The first study is the study where students had been supporting children sponsorship in schools. And we had been working with focus group, 32 focus group with 160 students, fed 14 to 18 years old in Germany. Second study, orientation of young people after North-South and South-North encounter trips. So you know that a lot of young students make encounter trips to other countries where they face global challenges in order to learn these global challenges. And we visited these groups until a half and 2 years after the visit. So we looked for the long-term learning outcome in 26 groups with approximately 90 young people, 15 to 25 years old from 3 countries, Germany, Rwanda, and Bolivia. And we looked from people going from Germany out and those from Rwanda and Bolivia coming to Germany. So north, south, south, north. And the third study about young adults after at least 3 months of voluntary services in the Global South with 22 narrative interviews from returned volunteers to Germany. So what is important for our study is that all these people had knowledge on global issues. So in the sense of the understanding of UNESCO and the understanding of the OECD, they had been very skilled. They had learned a lot. And they had been placed in global settings. So all of them had experiences in global settings. And we had been working on the action guiding orientation of their students and reflected the question, how do the young people, by having this knowledge and by being in a global situation, how do they understand global world society? And I would like now to summarize, of course, brief some observations and findings of the studies. These studies are very rich and they have a lot of ideas and recommendations for every of the 3 fields. And what I will do now is a rough summary. And all transcripts quoted are edited for reasons of comprehensibility. The first finding was that through the abduction process of all the data, we had been able to find 4 arenas of reflection. So the students reflected on the perception of others. They reflected on the localization of differences, so where to put differences. They reflected on how to deal with knowledge and complexity, and how they reflected on the motivation of their action taking. So these are 4 aspects which had been already coming out of the data as being the crucial aspects to reflect if you are reflecting on world society. So, second result, asymmetric orientation. In all 3 studies, groups and individuals understood the world society as being shaped by an orientation towards asymmetries in the sense of lack of equality of all levels. So young people from Germany received themselves as givers, whereas the partners in the Global South had been seen in a receiving role. So the situation of the economic inequality superimposed all other experiences. For example, German pupils in upper secondary schools feel already clearly superior to experienced teachers in southern countries. I quote, "They are not only dependent on the money, but also on the help, on the knowledge that comes from Europe. They have teachers, yes, but they are in no way as far as our secondary students are now." Conversely, the young people from participating countries in the South felt that they had been very inferior. So in all narratives, they show their orientation as being inferior. And the learning arrangement thus led in all three studies to an increase in self-esteem of the young people from the Global North. So the Global North people got an upgrade on their self-esteem, and some of them even explained this explicitly, like, so for example, as a white man, you are simply the person, and you are adored like such a little god. And I mean, in the beginning, it's all so nice and good, and your ego also rises. This student tells you. This makes very clear that a world social learning setting does not naturally lead to a perspective of joint work on the outstanding problems of this world. But there is a danger that structures or ascriptions of supposed superiority or inferiority are determined and possibly cultivated by such learning arrangement. Therefore, the dichotomy of a poor world with fewer possibilities and a rich world with more possibilities then is really learned as a perspective. And in my understanding, this does not show, this understanding of asymmetric orientation shows that the people have not understood the abstract social character of a globalized world. So the perception of others, we see some students in asymmetries. Third finding, orientation in vicinity and adding neighborhoods. A further important result is that student exchange, child sponsorship, voluntary service, these orientations emerge, which transform new experiences of strangeness, where you see new things in the other world, transform it into a new local area. So the newly experienced situation is becoming a new vicinity, a new neighborhood. So I give you an example now from a student from the Global South. So another thing, the markets of the Germans, that is different from here in Rwanda. When you go to the market here, you ask for the price of items and you earn the money you have. But in Germany, for example, the clothes, there were the prices and you pay directly. But it's not like this. You demand, you're discussing. So they experience differences, and we have hundreds of these descriptions where students talk about the difference of food, the difference of living, the difference of climate, the difference of timing, and so on. So the new world becomes the new neighborhood. And it's even going as far that some students who have a little child sponsorhood say, it's like our little child somehow, our own baby. So what we see is that these students are working on vicinity and proximity to reflect the differences of world society, and their understanding of world society is an addition of vicinities, what I have learned, so I go to another vicinity. We found groups as well which did not focus on this kind of vicinity, but identified communities of global belongings. So here, for example, another group from Rwanda. Before leaving, I asked myself, how would life look like? But how would people approach us? We do not speak the same language. We come from very different cultures. So I asked myself many questions. But I met the contrary. These families where we lived had really been Christian families. And we find this for religions, Catholic, Protestants. We find this for football organizations. We find this for music bands and so on, so that it is no more an orientation in vicinities, but in communities of global belonging. And that's another form of localization of differences. The next finding is the orientation towards authenticity. In the samples, we found orientation towards the expectation of being able to encounter the world in all dimensions authentically by your own experience. So what is authentic becomes important. So another group discussion. This is a group which are discussing a letter from a sponsored child from the Global South. And now the group is discussing about the authenticity of this letter. A, somebody helped her. Yes, as she cannot write very well. Yes, she does not know it very well, but she knows it however. I think the letter was from her, but not the writing, and this was not her scripture. She did not write this, it was somebody else. Yes, but she made the card by herself. So in this repeated reflection, we can observe that this group is struggling for authenticity. The students are orienting their solidarity on the fact that there is an authentic counterpart in a real existing relation. So for this student, it is central that they experience authenticity. And that means that this group is dealing with knowledge in a way that they try to reduce the complexity of the relations they have by finding out authentic anchors, by finding out authentic relationships. We had been other groups which had been working on the communities of belonging, which have been much more working on reducing complexity by identification in communities, as their perception of others was led by identification of communities as well. In the three studies, we also find young people who had been very oriented on abstract spaces and dealing with complexity. So they had been interested in the structures of world societies, in the structure of work of living together, showing an orientation without de-evaluation of others, so on equity level, and reflecting on the forms people can use for living together. These young people describe their experiences and reflect them by talking about forms of organization of societies, legal regulations. They reflect how their effects look like, and they think what constitutes a society. I really believe that I had a very important experience in what a new concept of order is. Order in society, order in behavior, order of a whole society. And then the students or the whole group starts to talk more than 1 hour about the question how societies can organize themselves in regulations, in freedom, and so on. So these students show an orientation on abstract spaces and on dealing with complexity. They see others on an equal level. They locate differences in different forms of orders and structures. They deal with knowledge by reflection of complexity, and they all are acting in a way or motivated to action by global participation. All of these students, and that's the interesting point as well, all of these students had been working together in international settings of participation. But I come back to this later. So if I summarize the observations from the 3 studies, one can state that knowledge about globality and individual experiences on globality does not automatically lead to a global competence in the sense of an unsociability or of an abstract social order. But it is much more that we could understand 3 different types by addition of vicinities. So people who understand world society in a way that they add different forms of vicinities, or by belonging to global communities, or by abstract social spaces. And depending from this orientation, people had been acting either by charity, either by solidarity, or either by global participation. So, and this shows that the understanding of the world society and dealing with the complexity of the world is much more than just know about globalization and much more than just understand the interconnectedness. And those who had been related to abstract social spaces were all. So first I have to say, I have to say that all these 3 types had been, and this was very surprising for us, independent from the school level and the age of the students. So we had young students already reflecting abstract social relations and old and so on. It was independent from coming from the south or coming from the north, and it was independent. It was independent from the long time involvement they had had. But all students who had been in this, reflecting in this way, had had experiences of guided self-reflection. They did not learn experience alone. They did not learn knowledge only. But in all reports of the young people, the connection of knowledge and experience with their own biography and their own self was very important, as well as a possibility of participation. So the combination of experience, knowledge, biography, and participation resulted in this learning field. However, all students who had been in this field had been related to charity programs. So a lot of schools in the moment, to being global interconnected, do programs like students' activity on selling cakes and donate this too. And we saw that these kinds of programs lead to an addition of vicinities. Our findings shows that learning is important, but learning arrangement play a very important role as well. And our findings are in coherence with other studies which has a more limited sample than we had, so Asban 2009, Carter-Wettstedt 2015. So they showed as well the risk of consolidation of paternalism and have been emphasizing on opportunities for global participation. So what does this mean as an outlook for research? So my central thesis, which I outline in this contribution, is that world society has some structural logic and can only be grasped only in categories of social groups from local area, national society, this does not work. So this is an not adequate perspective of world society. But it has a complexity, and the interdependence demand an even higher abstraction of reflection to understand and to influence this society. And this led to my understanding that global competencies must be founded on the understanding of an abstract sociality, and this could then help to master today's challenges facing world society. I would like to come back to the OECD survey, because the OECD will present the results of the survey on global competencies at the end of the year. The research concept has already been criticized by the lack of theoretical foundation, the lack of conceptual clearness, the lack of perspectives from the global south. But I would add, from my own research, the critique that the abstract character of the global world is not represented, and the whole survey is related to vicinities. So, for example, the OECD misses, in my understanding, the abstract sociality when, for example, items like, in our school we celebrate festivities from other cultures, are seen as an example for being global involved. Probably the studies of all students of my study would have been very good, would have been very, very well doing in the OECD survey, but from my understanding, some of them would miss the character of the global social world. And by this, I see the following aspects for further studies and for further survey. We need, of course, more research which is dealing with this complexity of the understanding of the world society. How does this understanding really develop? And what learning experiences lead to a complex understanding? For example, we are very unsure whether this reflection on an abstract order is going through the vicinity and global belonging, or is generated in a completely different way. So we do not know what are the aspects really which generate this. What learning experiences lead to a complex understanding? So we had some hints, but it would be very important to deepen this. And in what ways should local experiences and abstract understanding of local structures intertwine? And how do experiences and the dimension of making your own experience relate to knowledge, understanding, and reflection? Second aspect, we need to reflect deeper on the interplay and formal and informal learning, because I have the hypothesis that in this field, the interplay of the social learning in the society, so the informal learning, and the learning in the school itself as formal learning, plays a very important role. And we have to reflect this interconnected much deeper. Next aspect, I think it would be very interesting to go now further and to reflect whether these three forms or other forms from other scholars of the understanding of the global world society, which is coming from qualitative studies, can be found again in quantitative surveys. I see the big problem there, but of course people who have more experience maybe have solutions for that the value attitude such as paternalism is not easy to examine, as people might easily understand the social desirability, oh, that's a very difficult word, desirability of the data. And the interesting point is that in our interviews, of course, every student would be able to talk about paternalism, but by showing the paternalism themselves without really being aware of. So to have this in a quantitative assessment is, from my understanding, a challenge, but I think this challenge can there will be enough ideas, I think, to solve this. And I think what would be very important is to include the virtuality of learning in the internet and to include the perspectives of the Global South in this field. Because we have to work together in the interconnectedness world, interconnected world, and therefore we have to reflect the understanding of the world together. The thematic orientation of this Congress, Education in an Era of Risk, places our reflections and our research within the framework of a very important situation of human history. And there's indeed a lot at stake. And an essential, from my understanding, an essential task for our research is to understand these dramatic changes and to enhance learning in this field. And to understand the complexity of global learning, from my understanding, is the first step then to enhance the practice and to enable students really to understand better what is going on. And I think we should work together on education in this field by reflecting together our research and going step by step further on. And I hope with this little contribution I have enhanced your reflection on this topic. I would be very happy if this would be the case. And I thank you very much for your very kind attention.